Howdy folks, and welcome back to World of Warships once again with Rear Admiral Jingles, and today we're continuing the preview that we began earlier on in the week with the French cruisers, beginning at Tier 7 with the Algerie, or to give it its proper name, the Algeria. What? Don't look at me like that, France, it's not my fault you can't pronounce the name of the country properly. Anyway, the first of the French heavy cruisers in World of Warships, and in real life, the last of the French heavy cruisers. France never built any heavy cruisers after this ship. Now, you may be aware, if you watched yesterday's bonus video, that there have been some buffs and nerfs to the French cruisers since I uploaded, roughly around about 5 hours after I uploaded my initial preview from Tier 1 to 6. As far as the Algeria is concerned, it has received a buff. The turret rotation speed of these 203mm guns has been increased by 1 degree per second. However, at this time the buffs and nerfs have not yet been made live, so everybody is still playing. When you see the French cruisers in game, they're still playing in their unbuffed and unnerfed state, which means I'm still playing with the slow rotating turrets on the Algeria. However, as heavy cruisers go, the turret rotation isn't that bad. These turrets take 26.9 seconds to rotate 180 degrees with the expert marksman skill, which is pretty much exactly the same as the Pensacola. Way faster than the York and the Miyoko and the Indianapolis. In fact, it's not that much slower than the Shaw's, and the Shaw's only has 152mm guns. The guns are in fact pretty damn good. They're very, very accurate. Again, they've got that characteristically French good Sigma rating, very little vertical dispersion. They've got a good reload as well, 12 seconds. It's faster than the Miyoko, the Indianapolis and the Pensacola with the same caliber guns, and in fact it's exactly the same as the York with its 210mm guns. It also has the longest ranged guns of any of the Tier 7 heavy cruisers, with a firing range of 17.9 kilometers with the upgraded fire control system. It just strikes me as weird that they thought the Algeria needs a buff. We'll increase the turret rotation speed, or reduce the turret rotation speed. We'll buff it by 1 degree per second. It really didn't feel like it needed it. In fact, just about the only category in which the Algeria falls slightly behind as far as its guns are concerned over the other Tier 7 heavy cruisers is how many of them it has. It has 8. It's the same as the York, but the York has bigger guns. Indianapolis has 9, Pensacola and Miyoko had 10. But then again, the Algeria loads faster and starts shooting at you from further away, so why they thought they needed to buff the guns is a mystery to me. How about the armour protection, Jingles? Well, it's actually no worse than anybody else. At the end of the day, it is just a cruiser, but it's got a reasonably well protected armour belt along the side of the ship. The deck plating and the bow and rear plating isn't any worse than any of the other Tier 7 heavy cruisers. And of course, she has the same torpedoes as the Emile Bartin down at Tier 5. Spoiler alert, all of the French cruisers get the same torpedoes as the Emile Bartin down at Tier 5. They're not bad torpedoes though. They have a range of 9 kilometers, they're reasonably fast, 60 knots, and as you can see the firing arcs are fantastic. The only real downside is it can only put 3 into the water over each side of the ship, but other than that they're pretty good torpedoes. Any real downsides to this ship? Yeah. Anti-aircraft defense isn't particularly great. It has an AA rating of 41. Now, I think that that's quite deceptive actually. I'm not entirely sure where the AA rating of 41 comes from. If you look at the Pensacola, for example, that has an AA rating of 46. But the Pensacola chews up aircraft, and the Algeria, well, it doesn't. And that's down to the difference in DPM between the Pensacola's 20mm, 40mm and 100mm anti-aircraft guns, and the Algeria's 25mm, 37mm and 100mm anti-aircraft guns. Basically, the Pensacola has high DPM on those guns, the Algeria does not, so I don't really know where the Algeria's AA rating of 41 comes from. Those torpedoes are a very nice get-out-of-jail-free card when you're forced to bow tank a battleship, like the Scharnhorst, for example. If you absolutely definitely had to buff the Algeria rather than buffing the turret rotation speed, I would have said improve the top speed. The ship will do 31 knots, which is fine. It doesn't really need buffing, so, I mean, you know, if they're going to buff the turret rotation speed, I'm certainly not going to complain. But the Algeria is fine. So, the Algeria, it's a good ship, I like it, and it's only going to get better with a 1 degree per second turret rotation buff. So, Tier 8, the Charles Martel. Charlie here is also receiving a buff. Only this time I do agree that he did kind of need one. Not that he's a bad ship, far from it. I I like the Charles Martel as well. But there's not that much of a difference between Charlie here at tier 8 and the Algeria at tier 7. They're both 203mm gun-armed heavy cruisers. Charlie has 9 guns in 3 turrets, he's got 1 gun more than the Algeria. But other than that, the guns were actually worse. Yeah, I know, didn't make a whole lot of sense. How are they worse, Jingles? Well, they're identical in every other respect other than the firing range, which is actually less than the 17.9 kilometers of the Algeria at tier 7. Charles Martel at tier 8 has guns that fire out to 17.6 kilometers. It's not that much worse, but worse is worse. In every other respect, the guns were exactly the same, except that Charles Martel had 1 more of them. They had the same armor piercing and high explosive damage, the same 15% chance of fire on target from the high explosive shells, the same muzzle velocities for both the armor piercing and the high explosive, the same reload of 12 seconds. So what they've gone and done to the Charles Martel here is they've buffed the reload. They've dropped it from 12 seconds to 10. And that's really, really good, because it means the Charles Martel is the second fastest firing 203mm gun armed cruiser in the game. Not just at tier 8. It's faster than the Zhao, it's faster than the Ibuki, it's faster than the Rune, it's got the same reload as the Hindenburg, and that's tier 10. The only ship with 203mm guns that fires them faster than the Charles Martel is the Des Moines, and that's the American tier 10 cruiser, and it damn well should fire them faster because the 203mm guns on that thing are autoloaders. Well, it's not completely fair to say that the Charles Martel isn't that much better than the Algeria at tier 7. It is, even before, and I'm playing now without the reload speed buff, by the way, so the guns are taking 12 seconds to reload, which is still fast for a tier 8 heavy cruiser. But because this is a tier 8 cruiser, it has a better armour profile. It's got 25mm rather than 16mm of bow and aft plating. And again, the armour profile on this thing isn't substantially worse or better than any of the other tier 8 heavy cruisers. Top speed of 32.5 knots. Not much faster, but, you know, faster is still faster, especially in combination with the improved engine boost consumable that the French cruisers have, which gives you an extra 15 rather than 10%. Anti-aircraft firepower, however, again is a little on the mediocre side. And again, for the same reasons as with the Algeria, most of the grunt in the AA firepower is at short range. And even with the defensive fire consumable active, well, a determined carrier is going to land, he's going to be able to get his weapons away, and the only real difference that your AA firepower is going to make is the number of aircraft that manage to make it back to the carrier after they've released their weapons. What are you talking about, Jingles? You're carving up aircraft there, no problem. Well, am I? Because I'm not the only one shooting at them. There's a Pensacola back there, and a Leander, and a Farragut, and me, all carving up these dive and torpedo bombers, so it's not really any surprise that they're getting shot down. I wouldn't have been able to do that alone. As you can see, the manoeuvrability is pretty good. 7.9 second rudder shift time, and that, in combination with your defensive fire consumable, is what's going to stop you from being sunk by enemy aircraft carriers. The guns, they're not bad. Now I've got the high explosive loaded, and I'm lighting up this Pensacola. Chance of fire on target, 15%. 9 guns, better than average chance, especially combined with the accuracy of these guns, that you're going to be setting fires. Switch to armour piercing momentarily there because Pensacola, nom nom nom, and then of course, well, he's angled, so straight back to the high explosive. And again with this, well, at the moment 12 second, but it's going to be a 10 second reload, it doesn't hurt as much when you have to switch ammunition types. Set another fire with a high explosive, and I'm weathering his return fire very nicely thanks to the angling. My secondaries are opening up now. And he's given me the side, so I'm switching to armour piercing. 12 second reload, going to be a 10 second reload. Pensacola, made out of citadels. Om nom 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 nom. Friendly destroyer comes sailing past and provides me with a very, very welcome smokescreen. And I'm not paying attention to the Amagi, by the way. It's steaming down the narrows ahead of me. I'm focusing on this Leander. I'm thinking, wow, British cruiser. 203mm guns, I'm going to feast on his tears. And this is where I discovered a potential issue, one that definitely exists on the French tier 10 and I think might exist on the French tier 8 as well, and that's to do with the, well, watch this. 6.9 kilometers, 203mm guns, 9 shots, 6 hits, 5 of them bounced off the side of a Leander. Really, that can happen. I fired my second armor-piercing salvo, and then immediately switched to high explosive, only this time I get 2 more penetrations when he's at a better angle than I did with the first salvo, so I'm not entirely sure what's going on here. It could have just been a fluke, of course, but there's a definite issue which is being addressed with the French Tier 10. The 240mm armor piercing on the Henry IV suffers drastically from drag, which means that the shells slow down and therefore lose penetration despite the initial high muzzle velocity. Now that's a definite issue with the Tier 10 and its 240mm guns, which are pretty nasty at short range. But at ranges of more than 5 kilometers, the armor piercing performance is a bit hit and miss, and when I fired that initial armor piercing salvo at that Leander, at the side of that Leander, he was at a range of 6.9 kilometers, so I'm just wondering, and it might not be the case, I might have just gotten exceptionally unlucky, but I'm just wondering if that isn't also an issue down here at Tier 8. So, that's the Charles Martel, French Tier 8 heavy cruiser, and I do think it's a worthy successor to the Algeria. On paper it doesn't really look like that much of an improvement, but, well, it's faster, it's got better armour, the guns are slightly better, they certainly fire faster even if they have 300 metres less range, and they turn faster as well, which is something that I forgot to mention. The turret rotation speed is 3 seconds faster than the Algeria down at Tier 7, with what are pretty much exactly the same guns. At Tier 9 we have the Saint-Louis, and whereas the Charles Martel was a definite incremental upgrade over the Algeria at Tier 7, the Saint-Louis not so much. This ship is also getting buffed, and it does kind of need it. It's not a terrible ship, but in many respects it's not as good as the Charles Martel down at Tier 8. The armour is exactly the same, 25mm fore and end plating, 25mm deck plating, 100mm belt plating and 16mm all across the superstructure, but that's pretty much standard for Tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers. Obviously there are some exceptions, but as far as the armour is concerned, the ship's no better or worse than anybody else. As far as speed and manoeuvrability are concerned, it's probably worse. It is slightly faster, it will do 33 rather than 32.5 knots, so not a massive difference there. And the rudder shift time is around about a third slower, so it's less manoeuvrable. But it's the guns that really need some love on this ship, because they're pretty much exactly the same as the guns that you get not just on the Charles Martel at Tier 8, but the guns that you get on the Algeria at Tier 7, with some minor improvements. It's a bit like the British cruisers with their 152mm guns. They pretty much have the same guns from Tier 6 all the way up to Tier 10. The French cruisers have pretty much the same guns from Tier 7 all the way up to, well, Tier 9. The Tier 10 is an exception. But with the British light cruisers, while they're still effectively using the same guns from Tier 6 all the way up to Tier 10, I mean, they're not exactly the same guns, but they're more or less succeeding marks of the same gun. Those guns unquestionably get better as you advance through the tiers. They turn faster, they fire faster, and the accuracy stays consistently good. You don't get that with the French heavy cruisers. When you get to Tier 9 and you're still pretty much using the same guns that we're using at Tier 7, and they're not that much better, you can't help but feel a little bit mediocre. The Saint-Louis has the same 9 203mm guns as the Charles Martel at Tier 8. It has the same 23.4 second with the expert marksman skill turret rotation speed. It has the same initial muzzle velocity for armour piercing and high explosive as the Charles Martel at Tier 8. And it has the same 15% chance of fire on target with high explosive, and the same high explosive and armour piercing damage as the Algeria at Tier 7. It's got the same 12-second reload as the Charles Martel at Tier 8. In fact, the only real upgrade you're getting for going up to Tier 9 with the Saint-Louis is an extra 900 metres of range. And you're a bigger target, and you're less manoeuvrable. You do have substantially better anti-aircraft firepower at last. And you can also fit the aiming systems modification number 3, which will buff your main battery firing range to 21.3 kilometers, which is pretty good. And you're probably going to want to use that, because in just about every other respect, you're either the same or not quite as good as the ships that have preceded you. Now, I realise that all of this sounds pretty bad, but you have to keep it in perspective. The guns on this ship are still pretty good. It just doesn't really feel like you've taken a step up to Tier 9 when you unlock this ship. Now, I don't know if that says more about the Algeria at tier 7 than it does about the San Louis up here at tier 9. They are buffing this ship, however, and they're giving it exactly the same buff that the Charles Martel gets down at tier 8. They're reducing the loading time on these guns from 12 seconds, which it is currently, and that's what I'm playing with here, down to 10 seconds. So, again, no better than the ship that preceded it. The Charles Martel is also getting a reduction to its loading time from 12 to 10 seconds. So, yeah. What's at tier 10? At tier 10, you have this monster, Henri IV, or Henry IV. And this ship has the biggest guns on any cruiser in the game. Shut up. Don't come here talking about the Graf Spee. That's not a cruiser, it's a pocket battleship. I don't care where it is in the German tech tree. This ship has 240mm guns, and it has 9 of them. Unfortunately, they're not very good at the moment. More on that in a moment, however, because this ship has other issues. The next issue is to do with its armour. It only has 25mm of deck armour plating. Why is that important, Jingles? Well, it's very important, and it's the nail in the coffin for this ship because of the overmatch mechanics. If you're in a cruiser and you're getting fired upon by a battleship and you are heavily angled against him, providing your armour plating is at least 26.5mm thick, you can automatically ricochet a 15-inch or lower caliber armor-piercing shell. It will bounce, it will do no damage. So when you're in a battleship and you're shooting even at the side of an unangled cruiser, for example, at medium range, and your shots are going in at a pretty flat angle, and yet you're still getting bounces, what's actually happening here is those shots are not hitting the side of the ship. Instead, they're coming in at a flat angle and they're just skipping clean off the deck armor. That's why you're getting the ricochets even when you're firing at the side of a cruiser. The important number here is that 26.5mm. If your deck plating is more than that, any shot that comes in from a 15-inch or lower gun that hits at a flat angle is going to skip. It's just going to bounce off. It's not going to do any damage. That's why the Des Moines, the American Tier 10 cruiser, has exactly 27mm of deck plating. It means that it can, under the right circumstances, bounce shots from, for example, the Bismarck, because the Bismarck has 15-inch guns. Of course, if anything with a 16-inch gun is shooting at it and hits the deck at a flat angle, it's going to overmatch and penetrate anyway, so that's bad news if you're getting shot at by any battleship other than the Bismarck if you're in the Des Moines. If you have 30mm of deck plating, you can even bounce shots from 16-inch guns, and only the Yamato with its 18.1-inch guns can overmatch you. What kind of cruisers have 30mm of deck plating? Well, that would be the Zau and the Hindenburg, and the Moskva, because it's a battleship and not a cruiser, has 50mm of deck plating. So even the Yamato can't overmatch the deck armour of the Moskva because, you know, Russian. 16-inch gun on battleships can't overmatch the deck armour of the Zau, the Moskva, or the Hindenburg. 15-inch gun battleships cannot overmatch the armour of the Zau, the Moskva, the Hindenburg, or the Des Moines. But every battleship, hell, even the Warspite, and it's tier 6, can overmatch the deck armour of Henry IV. And that's a bit of an issue, because every battleship that shoots at this ship is going to overmatch not just the bow and stern plating, and that's common to all of the tier 10 cruisers, but it's going to overmatch the deck as well. The bad news does not end there. This ship also has a couple of issues with its guns, one of which is being addressed. The issue that's being addressed is to do with, and I mentioned this previously, it's to do with the very high drag factor of the ammunition fired from these 240mm guns. Apparently, despite the high initial muzzle shell velocity, these shells slow down really, really quickly. The armor-piercing shells, that is. At ranges in excess of 10 kilometers, they just don't penetrate. Lots of bounces, lots of shatters, the occasional penetration. In order for these guns to actually bite into the target, you pretty much have to close the range to less than 10 kilometers. At that range, even without scoring citadels, your armor-piercing salvos can do a substantial amount of damage, even to a target like the Yamato. The problem, of course, is that battleships do like it when cruisers close to within 10 kilometers of them, because then even battleships find it hard to miss. You can't bow tank them because you're in a cruiser, and all tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers only have 25mm of bow plating. And because you're in the Henry IV, any armor-piercing shots that somehow manage to miss your bows and instead hit the deck, they're going to penetrate too. That issue is, however, being fixed. They are looking at the drag coefficient at the armour-piercing shells, and that's due to be applied soon. But there's another issue with this ship's guns, and that's to do with the high explosive shells. Put simply, the last time I saw this many shatters when I was firing at a battleship with high explosive, I was in a Farragut. I can understand that in a Farragut because it only has 127mm guns. But these are 240mm guns at point-blank range, firing into the superstructure of a battleship. And your shells still shatter and do no damage. And that for me really encapsulates what I think the biggest problem is with this ship. It's the cruiser with the biggest guns that there are in World of Warships. Yes, I know, but the Grafspee isn't a cruiser, it's a pocket battleship. And it just doesn't feel like it's got the biggest guns available to any cruiser in World of Warships. I first saw the ship in my port and I thought, wow, 240mm guns, this is going to be good. But I'm just not feeling it. Compare the ship to the Moskva, which has 220mm guns and used to be the cruiser with the biggest guns in the game. Those 220mm guns only do 400 less armour-piercing damage per shot, and they fire nearly twice as fast. Oh, and they've got a longer range as well. Oh yes, and the Moskva can't get its deck plating overmatched even by the Yamato. It has exactly double the deck armour of the Henry IV. The Henry IV can get its deck armour overmatched by the Fuso or the Warspite. It does have 22% chance of fire on target with the high explosive shells, however, and that is very, very good. But, well, those high explosive shells first have to actually explode when they hit the target, rather than shattering on the superstructure, which is what they do half the time now. In its current form, this is a very, very frustrating ship to play. You constantly feel like you should be doing more damage than you actually are. And a large part of the damage that I'm doing at the moment, thanks to that 22% chance of fire on target, is from... And because these guns are accurate, I mean, credit where credit's due, they are still very accurate guns. So the majority of the shots that I'm firing at targets are hitting them. And those high explosive shells that don't shatter are probably going to start a fire. So you do a lot of fire damage in this ship, but you just feel like you should be doing so much more because you've got 240mm guns. Now, yes, the issues with the armour piercing are being addressed, but I definitely think there's an issue with the high explosive as well. These shells should not shatter as much as they do. I could understand it if I was in a Farragut with 127mm guns, but I'm not. I'm in the top-tier French cruiser. Nevertheless, work in progress. All stats subject to change. I definitely think there's something wrong with the high explosive ammunition, and I really do hope Wargaming investigate. Torpedoes, of course, always reliable. And rather than dwelling on the negative aspects, one really outstanding feature of this ship is its speed. This is the fastest cruiser in the game. It has a top speed of 36.8 knots. And because it's French, it has access to an enhanced version of the speed boost consumable, which boosts that speed by 15%. And what that means is that even without running a speed flag, when you use the speed boost on this ship, it will top out at 40.2 knots. Good luck running away from this ship, any destroyer that isn't the Khabarovsk. Hang on, that's Russian, isn't it? I'm beginning to see a pattern emerging here. Oh, actually, I've just realised I was wrong. At the time of recording this replay, that 15% speed boost consumable hadn't yet been implemented, so I'm running with the 10% speed boost consumable, and without a speed flag, topping out at 40.2 knots. Once that change gets implemented, and while running a speed flag, this ship is not going to be much slower than 44 or 45 knots. And the guns are very, very accurate. And the 240mm high explosive is unlikely to shatter when it hits a destroyer. So, destroyers, if you got one of these things on your tail, good luck with that. There have been some mutterings of unrest about that speed boost consumable, however, and I'm inclined to agree. I don't think 15% is enough. Or maybe leave it at 15%, but buff the base speed of the other cruisers. Not this one, it's fast enough. But buff the base speed of the other cruisers so that they get more from that 15%. Because, well, if you look at the Algeria, the Charles Martel, for example, with a speed of 31, and I think it's 32.5 knots, yeah, it could be better. The lower the base speed of the ship, the less benefit you get from the speed boost consumable. If you want the French to be quick, and really quick in an emergency, I do feel that something needs to be looked at, because on every other French cruiser that gets the speed boost consumable, other than the Henry IV, which is fantastic with that speed boost consumable, it's really just not enough. Also, no big surprise at this stage, the ship's anti-aircraft firepower is pretty bad. It's the same story at Tier 9, Tier 8 and Tier 7. It does at least get access to the defensive fire consumable, so that's nice. But you're going to be using a lot of the damage repair party consumable on this ship, thanks to the atrociously bad armour. It's not that you can't bounce shells in this ship, you can. If an armor-piercing shot comes in even from a Yamato and hits your belt armour, where it's 100 and in some places 140mm thick, it's going to bounce. It's not going to do any damage. But you can't bow tank anything in this ship, okay? You can't bow tank anything in any of the Tier 10 cruisers. Well, other than other cruisers, because they all have 25mm of bow plating. But that 25mm of deck plating. Battleships are going to love shooting at this thing. Oh, there is one other nice feature about this ship, in addition to its outstanding speed, and that's the torpedo protection. It gets 21%. That's pretty good. It's way better than the Des Moines, which is terrible, and only gets 7%. It's better than the Zhao, it's better than the Hindenburg. It's not better than the Moskva, of course, which gets, I think, 28%. Because Russian, you know. There's a definite pattern emerging here. So, anyway, Henry IV. I don't want to say this is a bad ship. In its current form, remember, work in progress, all stats subject to change. But it is a bad ship in its current form, and yet it could so easily be a good ship. All you have to do is just give it another 2mm of deck plating. I mean, we're not asking for it to be able to bounce 16-inch shells from its deck armour. Hell, the Des Moines manages to do all right, and the Des Moines can't bounce 16-inch shells from its deck armour. Just another 2mm of deck armour would mean that it couldn't get lol-penned by absolutely every battleship that it's going to face. Take a look at the high explosive shells, because I'm convinced there's something wrong there. 240mm high explosives should not shatter on battleship superstructure. The speed is fine, the manoeuvrability is fine. The guns need more punch. They don't feel like the largest caliber cruiser guns in the game. Fix the deck plating. Give it at least another 2mm of deck plating, because it's a Tier 10 cruiser. It should not get lol-penned on the deck by a warspite. Do that, and this could be a good competitive Tier 10 cruiser. At the moment, and once again, all stats subject to change, that's why there's a work in progress watermark on the video, this is not a good competitive Tier 10 cruiser. So, that's pretty much it. That's the roundup of the French cruisers Tier 1 to 10. Obviously the Tier 1 to 6 video featured earlier on in the week. And today we've looked at the Tier 7, 8, 9 and 10. Love the Tier 7. Very much like the Tier 8. Not too happy with the Tier 9 and 10. I can live with the Tier 9 being a bit of a dog. I mean, there's usually a turkey in just about every ship line in the game. But if the Tier 10 is a dog, there's not much incentive for people to bother starting down that line of ships. So I really do hope Wargaming lavish a bit more love and attention on the Tier 10, because I do like the French cruisers, and you have no idea how much it costs me as an Englishman to say that. But they are good ships. Despite the nerfs that were handed out to the lower tier ships, I think that they're still pretty good. If I'm being completely honest, they were probably a little bit overpowered. And maybe some of those nerfs were justified. Others, maybe not so much, but time will tell. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.